Silicone painting techniques. In this tutorial, we're going to cover the process of some simple painting techniques for platinum silicones. If you're watching this video, you probably arrived at this point because you cast up a silicone skin. Maybe it's a medical simulator or a silicone doll or a silicone mask or just a body part for a horror film. But at any rate, you're probably at that point where you've cast your silicone part in platinum silicone and now you're ready to give it a realistic paint job. So in this tutorial, we're going to cover that process and just go over a very simple method for painting a cast part. Now for our example, we're going to paint up a partial face that we cast in a previous tutorial. And we did this using the 5110 silicone. This is 5110 platinum silicone. Now, before we get started, it's important to go over some critical details about painting platinum silicone. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the things you need to know, but here's the top of the list stuff. Fresh silicone is ideal, and what I mean by that is freshly cast silicone parts, especially platinum silicone, paints best when it's fresh. So make sure you're casting and painting your parts as soon as possible. Also, clean off any mold release. I typically use acetone to clean off any of the mold release I've used in the casting process before I paint. If you don't remove mold release, you won't be able to get the paint to stick. Also, work in a well-ventilated area. Even though you're using an odorless solvent for this process, you still always want to take precautions, especially if you're airbrushing, to make sure that you minimize any kind of fumes or any silicone that might be in an aerosol form in your work area. And of course, wear gloves. Anytime you're handling chemicals like this, it's always a good idea to wear nitrile gloves. And last but not least, good painting takes practice. Always make sure you practice and build your skill level to where it needs to be before doing a critical project. Now to begin, I'm going to go over the basic materials you need to do this process. Gloves should be fairly obvious, but just a quick side note about gloves. Anytime you're working with platinum silicone, it's good practice to make sure you're wearing nitrile gloves or vinyl gloves and not latex gloves. Now what we'll be using as a paint base in this, again, we're going to do this as simple as possible. We're using the SAM32 silicone sealant. This is a one-part silicone adhesive. And this can be used for minor repairs and sticking parts back together, but it also works really well as a paint base. And as it comes, it's just in a little tube like a tube of toothpaste. And this one-part silicone sealant doesn't require any catalyst. It will air dry on its own, but more about that later. But that's a real important part of this. This is a fast-drying silicone sealant that sticks incredibly well to platinum silicone parts that are, of course, free of any mold release. Now, second important material is, of course, the OSS, and that is the odorless silicone solvent. And this is what's used to break down that silicone sealant or silicone adhesive to turn that into a paint base. And one of the nice things about the OSS is it's a slow drying solvent, and that gives you the maximum amount of time for painting. And of course, to pigment this, we're going to use silicone pigments. Now, real important, always use compatible materials. You don't want to use acrylic paint for this because acrylic paint will act as an accelerator for that one-part SAM32 silicone adhesive. So really important, make sure you're using a compatible silicone pigment. Now, also, we're going to use brushes, and I just use these little cheap throwaway brushes for this process, but the more critical the paint job, the better quality brushes you want to use. So just remember, if you're using high quality brushes, you want to be prepared to clean those so that they will hold up throughout the process. Now, first thing we're going to do is we've dispensed a little bit of the SAM32 into a wax paper cup. And again, the wax paper cup is important because that resists that solvent later on. You want to make sure everything in your process is compatible for this. And to pigment that, we're first going to pigment the SAM32 before we add our solvent. So I'm just grabbing a little bit of pigment on a popsicle stick and mixing that into that SAM32. Now, even though this is not catalyzed, you want to take care to move quick because this is a fast-setting silicone adhesive. Unlike just regular clear silicone sealant, this will set up pretty fast. So you want to be careful that you don't waste any time getting that color mixed in. Now, once we've got that mixed in, and we're going to make this a little bit more opaque of a color than we would typically do when we're just pigmenting silicone for casting. That's an important detail because when we thin this out for painting, that's going to spread that pigmentation out. And if we were to go a little bit more on the translucent side on this, we'd wind up with a very faint color. So that's one of those things that definitely takes some practice and getting used to, is how much pigment you need to get your coloration right. This is why it's also a good idea to keep a scrap piece of silicone on hand to test some of your colors, because when you're starting out, it's always a good idea to get a feel for what things are going to look like on silicone before you start painting a critical piece. Now, you can add a fair amount of the OSS solvent because that is all going to evaporate off, leaving that silicone sealant behind. So I've added to that very small amount, maybe just about 5 or 6 grams of silicone sealant, I added probably about a half an ounce or so of the OSS solvent. And so again, you can be fairly liberal with that solvent, especially if you're going to be airbrushing, because again, airbrushing just requires more solvent than brush painting. Now, really, the only difference you're going to run into when you add more solvent is, of course, you're going to spread out that pigment. So you might have to add a little bit more pigment to your base, but also it's just going to slow down the time it takes for that to dry. So you want to be aware of all of those factors. And again, practice makes perfect. The more of this you can play around with on a test piece, the better you'll get. And speaking of which, this is by no means the be-all, end-all on silicone painting. I wanted to just show some quick techniques for those of you that want to do this process without getting too involved. This is about the simplest approach to silicone painting. So here I'm just starting with the lip color, and then I'm just going to use that color. I've mixed up that a little bit of flesh tone and a little bit of the red to get that kind of lip color, but I'm also going to use that to give a little bit of color to the surrounding skin areas, the nose and the eyes and the ears. And what I wanted to show with this tutorial, again, not at all an expert painting tutorial, but I mainly wanted you to see just the overall methodology used for this, because overall this is a pretty simple process. And if I, as just a simple caveman, can make a piece look decent like this, then there's no telling what you artists out there are going to be capable of. Now, I like to work in stages where I apply a little bit of the color and then pull that back with a clean paper towel, and especially around the eyes, where I like to actually over apply the silicone paint and then pull that back with that paper towel. And the reason for that is that allows me to really get that color into areas like little wrinkles and the creases around the eyes and the nose and things like that. So again, this is one of those things, there's no wrong way to do this, provided it looks the way you want to when you're done. Now, once I've applied a layer of color, I like to go in and set that with a hair dryer. And you don't have to do this step, but this will make your work go a lot faster. I just use a hair dryer on high to set that layer, and then start my next layer of color. And if you don't do that, obviously not the end of the world, but if you don't do that, what happens is that fresh color you're applying starts to intermix with that previous layer and create some kind of muddy colors on there that start to intermix, and you'll start to lose that detail, and it kind of softens some of your detail by doing that. So real important to get those nice crisp layers, especially when you start doing things like freckles and painting veins and things like that. Setting that with a hairdryer or a heat gun will really improve the quality of the paint job. And now I'm just going to go in with a kind of a bruise color. I'm just going to do about 3 different colors for this video. I'm doing that lip color, kind of a bruise tone, and then I'm going to end with kind of a freckle color. And again, same rule applies here. I'm just mixing in my color into my silicone sealant. And then I'm going to thin that out using the OSS. And again, that is the odorless silicone solvent. Now, once I've got the solvent put into my cup, again, these are wax paper cups, so I don't have to worry about the solvent breaking down plastic. This is a pretty mild solvent, but any of you that are using naphtha to paint, you want to be really careful about that, because naphtha, typically you got to use polypropylene cups. But these wax paper cups like this work great with that OSS solvent. And again, that's a very mild solvent that is odorless, but it's always a good idea with any solvent, any paint base like this, to work in a well ventilated area. Now, again, the same rules apply with the second layer of color. I'm just going to apply that bruise color to some of those cut areas, and again around the eyes and the nose, and then just use that to give it a little bit more life, especially around the neck, and give it a more vascular look. This is for the bride of Biddy. So bride of Biddy has been through a lot, so we want the skin to reflect that. But real important, again, obviously your paint scheme is going to differ depending on the piece you're doing. So this is, again, really more of a practice skin that I'm doing here, but same thing applies for when you're working on a doll or a mask. Having a scrap piece of silicone or a reject cast is really helpful to be able to work on your painting techniques, and again, work on the way the silicone takes paint. Because if you're used to painting latex masks and opaque paint jobs, it's a very different painting method. So it does take some getting used to. So again, here I've applied my color, and then I'm going and pulling back some of that color with a clean paper towel. And then of course, once that's on, I come back with my hair dryer and set that layer. And the best way to get a really natural paint scheme is to work in very thin layers and gradually build up the color that you want. So do as many layers as it takes to get a really realistic paint job. You don't want to try to do the whole thing in 2 or 3 layers. Make sure you're taking your time and building up those washes of color, and that again is what really builds that realism. Now, again, for this video, because I want to keep this short and simple, we're going to wrap this up with showing a technique for creating freckles. So again, here I've mixed up some of the silicone sealant with some brown pigment, and then I'm going to break that down with a little bit of the OSS solvent. And then I'm going to flick this on. And many of you have probably seen this technique in some of our previous videos. And to do this technique, we first need to make a flick brush. And to do this, we're just going to cut down a little cheap chip brush. I'm just using one of our 1/2-inch brushes here, and clipping this down to about 3/8 of an inch long. And that cutting those bristles down just gives us that ability to just flick that paint on. And that gives us a very organic look. As you'll see here, one of the things I always like to do with this is before I start painting my piece, I always like to test that flick pattern on a piece of white foam core board, just so I can see what that's going to look like, and that'll give you a good idea as to how that's going to spread, and give you an idea if you need to add more or less silicone solvent. Now, when you're using this method, it's a good idea to start off farther away from your piece and work in towards it. Once you get a feel for how your little flick pattern works, then you can get closer to the piece. But I always start out far away and then work my way in. And even though we're doing freckles here, you can do this with a variety of different colors, and layering colors up this way really gets some nice realistic skin tones going on. Now, when you're finishing up, you can use a paper towel to remove any of that excess color. And it's real important to dab that and not smear it, because obviously you don't want to smear those freckles and create little lines. So you want to make sure you just dab that clean paper towel on to remove any of that extra material. And once we've finished that up, now for this we're going to call it done. We're just done a few colors for the sake of this video, but once we're done with that, again, once that final layer is applied, you want to again use your heat gun or your hair dryer to set that layer of paint. Now, a part that's done this way, be it a silicone mask or a doll or a medical simulator or a body part prop, whatever it is you're making, when you apply a silicone sealant this way to a piece, you're going to naturally end up with a glossy finish. And for some things, obviously there are times when you want a gloss finish and other times when you do not. Now, when you do not want a gloss finish, when you want a nice matte finish, that's where we recommend the SAM SFP, the silicone finishing powder. Now, unlike baby powder or Cabasil, this is a little micropolymer, a little bead actually, that creates a much more realistic feel on the skin, especially if you're making medical simulators, and our doll making customers really like this stuff for making very realistic feeling dolls. That especially the way they photograph is different. Sometimes baby powder, when it's used as a matting agent, can reflect the flash and you get this really weird washed out look on a part that has too much powder on it. So real important when you're finishing a part like this, this silicone finishing powder is the ideal way to give a matte finish. The next best option would be fumed silica, and then of course you can also use translucent or colorless face powder. But you want to be very careful that whatever matting agent you're using is appropriate for the job that you're doing. And you'll notice that just by applying a little bit of that finishing powder over the top, that also really helps subdue that paint job a lot, just by knocking down that shine. Now, one last detail, always important to make sure your entire paint job is done before applying any finishing powder. Obviously, this is for a video here and we're not doing a full paint job, but just remember, as soon as you apply that matting agent, it will be difficult to get silicone sealant to stick over the top of that. So there you have the process of painting using the SAM32 and of course the OSS odorless solvent. And as always, these materials are available on our website. All of the materials used in our tutorials are available from our web store at brickintheyard.com. And of course, you can check the links on the end screen for some of the other casting tutorials using the 5110 silicone. So be sure to check those out, and I'll put some links in the video description both to all of the products that we used as well as to our video library, where we have a lot more resources on casting and painting with platinum silicone. Thanks again for watching, and again, be sure to check our links at brickintheyard.com, and if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe.